With so much happening in such a short amount of time, it's easy to overlook things like Subaru's new power. It's not often he gets new tools added to his arsenal, but with the addition of Beatrice, he's actually developed 3. That's 3 one-of-a-kind abilities completely unique to him, one of which we actually got to see in action against Regulus. This was just a small part in an otherwise grand encounter, so in addition to all the craziness that happened here, I'll also go over the more detailed past involving Garfiel and his mother. Everything this intense and emotional episode of ReZero left out from the light novels. Before we get started though, allow me to introduce today's sponsor, Watcher of Realms, a next-gen fantasy RPG both on mobile and PC, now starting its brand new Way of the Samurai Bushido event. So if you like those dedicated to the blade like Wilhelm or Reinhardt, then you definitely don't want to miss out on the new hero Kigedi. As a once sacred guardian, now turned undying avenger, Kigedi's kit comes not only with a compelling backstory, but also abilities befitting a person that's on the path of revenge. He's the perfect hero to experience the Way of the Samurai with, one complete with a new skin too. The event also comes with numerous rewards, a lot of which can be earned just by logging in. For those a bit more dedicated though, the Black Blade Chronicles event means you can earn Kigedi's exclusive artifact, avatar border, and more. There's a constant influx of events always being added to the game. As for the rest, there's a diverse collection of over 200 unique, well-designed heroes with stunning CG and animations, a mechanism of real-time battles that's both easy to understand and strategic, making your placement and timing affect the results of each battle, then a lot of exciting game modes where you can either team up with guild members to challenge the bosses, or compete in GVG where you can command your demon soldiers to attack enemy bases for rich rewards. Watcher of Realms has quite a bit of depth to it. So whether you're looking for a rewarding tactical RPG or a new samurai-themed gameplay experience, Watcher of Realms now has both. Just use the link in the description or scan the QR code to download it for free today. But now, let's get back to the video. Episode 53, Gorgeous Tiger, covering chapters 2 to 4 from volume 17 of the light novel. Last week I had stopped midway through the Amelia and Sirius fight, so to start there, a whole conversation was cut. Before closing out the fight in a blazing flame of rage, Sirius first made clear what she deemed as love. To her, it was the ideal of many becoming one. The bonds forged by shared feelings allowing everyone to experience another's joy and sadness. This was something Sirius knew Amelia could never obtain herself, but out of innate curiosity to understand it anyway, Amelia still went on to question it. She was truly intrigued enough to confidently ask, what love? This only stirred Sirius's anger more and sent her deeper into another spiral of threats and insults. It had led to the charge that we saw in the anime and the overall outcome where Regulus would have to save her. If you're wondering why Subaru couldn't do anything to save her himself, it's because Sirius's authority had taken effect on him. The fear Tina had being Sirius's captive quickly spread in an infinite loop between him, Luzbel, and Beatrice. All 3 trembled as fear became their entire existence. This paved the path for Regulus to step in instead, leading to an even longer rant about respect. You see, in addition to defining the basics of common courtesy, Regulus also suggested that perhaps Subaru denied his rights on purpose. That, or maybe Subaru was just unintelligent. Either way, the argument Regulus made was supported by the same superficial logic as Sirius's. What I mean is that, sure, their remarks may sound reasonable when they're speaking, but that forced rationality was always underpinned by these insane statements nestled within. It was obscenity hidden behind a facade of normalcy. Regulus then went on to directly contest Sirius's idea of love, since her clinging to a dead man was fundamentally flawed. Reason being that, for him, if the person he loved died, then it only made sense to proactively search for another. That was what Regulus believed to be a law of the world, the extent of nature as he knew it. To disobey that made Sirius no different than garbage, and that was a notion that didn't sit too well with her. So, as she swung her chains out of pure unrelenting anger, the ones that looked as if they had made direct impact did nothing as they bounced right off of him. It was as if they were reflecting right off the side of his face. This made it clear that Regulus had the advantage, which made Subaru worried that he might just kill Sirius. It would mean the end for him and everyone else in the square. Luckily he didn't, but the fear of facing down 2 archbishops was starting to get overwhelming. If not for Beatrice supporting him every step of the way, then Subaru knew that he wouldn't have been able to do anything. So it's because she was there and lending him her power that Subaru felt he could stand and actually do something. It was enough motivation to produce a somewhat decent attack on Regulus. Subaru knew that he wouldn't be able to hurt Regulus, but by at least binding him, he thought perhaps he could hinder his movements. Shamok was then supposed to nullify his senses, but just as we saw, it didn't have any effect whatsoever. It had forced Subaru to use his new special ability, EMM, the first of 3 spells jointly developed by him and Beatrice, and the only of its kind to exist in the entire world. As an original spell activated through the transfer of mana from Subaru to Beatrice, Subaru would send mana directly from his broken gate, then in return, an invisible magic field would cover his entire body. The result was an absolute defense which physically cut him from the world itself. It prevented anything from interacting with Subaru whatsoever. So, regardless of whether it was a person or thing, any being covered by this invisible field of magic would find themselves removed from the physical plane, albeit temporarily. It's what allowed Subaru to dodge Regulus the way that he did. Whereas death was what awaited him had Regulus made contact with him, what happened instead was Subaru completely bypassing him. That was the effect of EMM. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long though, as in its current state, 1 hit was the most that it could cover him for. That said, it was just enough time for Subaru to land a hit himself. An initial physical punch that was nullified completely, then a secondary invisible punch that had actually landed. The first physical punch had provided some pretty useful information, since while Subaru knew that he felt his fist make contact, the lack of damage or any other sign of literally anything happening made it clear Regulus had damage nullification of his own. It was as if he existed within his own permanent EMM state. The outcome was vastly different when Subaru's Invisible Providence landed, since the force from that had actually gone to stagger Regulus. Whereas every other attack did absolutely nothing, this one half-baked authority surprisingly did. Now, I know the anime made it seem like Regulus tanked it just like all the others, but by having it directly contrast with the physical punch made immediately before, it makes it clear that this was different. Somehow Subaru had managed to bypass Regulus's defenses. His attack didn't just bounce off like how all the others did. Subaru didn't have time to realize this in the moment though, since his primary focus was saving Emilia. Because Invisible Providence came at the cost of his very soul though, the result of using it began to torment his insides. You see, as a forbidden art that exceeded Subaru's body's capacity, Invisible Providence corrupted his soul every time he used it. It left his body reeling in pain and deteriorated the one thing that should never be touched. This was the price of using an authority that was incomplete, and it often left Subaru looking like this. All of this wasn't as useless as you might think it was though, since this little skirmish revealed crucial information about Regulus. It had showed Subaru that Greed's movements were sluggish. If he had to classify it in terms of levels, Regulus's skills for combat were just above that of a novice. Like, Subaru himself believed that even he was more competent. To him, Regulus's style of fighting seemed amateur through and through. This provided hope to an otherwise bleak situation, since lethal attacks didn't mean anything if they didn't connect. It was a potential weakness Subaru thought maybe he could capitalize on. With their fight now pretty much done though, Regulus would go on to speak about why he wanted Emilia. Apparently he didn't uphold his vow last time, so in accordance with his ideal of seeking out a new partner, Regulus resolved to do so this time. He wasn't gonna yield when it came to living the tranquil life he thought he deserved. He would protect and cherish Emilia in his own twisted way, and he would do so just because it was his right to. Everything was also he could maintain his own small slice of happiness. If it meant protecting that, then Regulus had no problem exploiting the powers he'd been granted. So, once again, Subaru was confronted with more twisted logic, but what terrified him more was the conviction with which Regulus spoke it with. For the first time, Subaru felt genuine fear from Regulus. It was as if the words he spoke were how he truly felt. This led Subaru to deny Regulus vehemently, stating how Emilia was his bride instead. It wasn't waifu like how the anime translated it, but instead bride, which is a lot more fitting given the context. Now, it was in the meantime that Beatrice was charging up, getting ready to use the third of their original spells. They still didn't know how Regulus's damage nullification worked, but whatever this next attack was, it was apparently very much worth trying. It was right before Subaru could unleash it, though, that Sirius would intervene and stop him, revealing her passionate interest in who Subaru was now. Before, she'd only ever been looking at Amelia and Beatrice, but now she was staring directly at him. So, to Subaru, the potential of Romane Conti being this prominent family in the witch cult was always just a joke that he'd only entertain in passing. To find out it was actually a legitimate husband and wife team, well, that was way beyond anything he'd ever expected. It made Sirius's hatred towards Amelia all the more confusing, since her ties to Satella should have made her an object of worship. Her desires directly conflicted with what Betelgeuse wanted. Everything came to an end once the noon bell rang, which, surprisingly enough, Sirius actually acknowledged. Though she clearly wasn't satisfied with the outcome, whatever was compelling her to move on, it was much more important than her reunion with her beloved. She did, however, exit on one final affirmation, once again proclaiming her ideology, except this time mixing parts of Betelgeuse's. Specifically the notion that pain makes you savor life, and life exists so that one can prove their love. So, if love to her is the wish to become one, then this joining of pain was a true expression of it. It was a statement that went to challenge Beatrice's own idea of love. She, however, retorted with her own example, basically saying how her and Subaru became one long ago, yet by not becoming anything like Sirius, it was enough to deny everything she stood for. She had essentially stood her ground and rejected the Archbishop in front of her. Beatrice didn't remain focused on that for long though, as healing was the main priority now. Unfortunately, Wrath's authority didn't share that healing, so if Beatrice wanted to save everyone, then she would have to do so person to person. Fast forward now to when Subaru wakes up, and aside from retelling the situation to Al and Felix, the only thing worth mentioning is the special condition binding Subaru and Beatrice. As a special type of spirit, Beatrice couldn't accept mana from anyone other than Subaru. It's a condition that's effectively sidelined her, since Subaru simply can't supply sufficient amounts of mana. It's the main burden Beatrice constantly has to deal with. This made Subaru's options very limited, and provided even fewer ways to navigate this. If we were to look on the bright side though, I guess the only bit of good news was that Beatrice's condition wasn't gonna worsen. She just needed help waking up, something no one present could do right now. Krush would then arrive to discuss what happened, meeting Subaru in the field hospital, since to ask Subaru to come to her would be inappropriate. It's the stage for the meeting that we saw in the anime, which is actually the point where the episode ends. The stuff with Garfiel happens all the way after, essentially serving as a bit of a flashback. So, to switch gears to that, the best place to start is at the house. It was at this point that Garfiel was still uncertain whether this was actually his mother or not. The last time he'd seen her was when he was just a baby, and the only reason he was even able to recognize her now was simply due to his vivid trial back in Sanctuary. That made it clear that his mother died searching for their father, so as far as Garf knew, the reunion he truly desired was nothing more than a distant fantasy. To him, this Liara Thompson could not be Alicia Tinzel. She was just someone coincidentally identical. That's what Garfiel wanted to think, but everything about Licia's behavior indicated otherwise. It was then that Garfiel would remember Licia's past, recounting every tragedy as it happened to her. So it all started with her family's debt, leading her to be sold to slave traders while still a child. Those slave traders were then raided by demi-human bandits, and Licia would then become a slave to them instead. They would eventually abandon her after she became pregnant with Frederica, leaving her to be picked up by yet another group of bandits. It was then that she would give birth to Frederica, and that was a time that neither really spoke about. All Garfiel knew after was that as soon as Licia became pregnant with him, that's when both her and Frederica fled to safety. It was the move which would result in her inevitable home at Sanctuary. So, this was the misfortune that was Licia's life, at least up until she was adopted by Roswaal. To him, she was described as both mysterious and incomprehensible, a person who always kept her happiness close. The reason why was never made clear, but Roswaal imagined it was the motivation keeping her going. These were the words Roswaal shared one night when him, Garf, and Otto were drinking. Garfiel's own impressions were a little bit different though, since for his mother to leave a peaceful place like Sanctuary, well, that just didn't make any sense to him. It made her seem like somewhat of an airhead, especially since it was the decision which he thought led to their death. In the end, Garfield still didn't know what his mother was thinking back then, and more importantly, the source of her happiness still remained a mystery. They were burning questions he hoped at least one day he might be able to find an answer to. In any case, with Fred's sister constantly urging Garfield out, he didn't feel welcome until Fred himself said something. The way he came up and grabbed onto his sleeve froze Garfield and filled his head with regret. It made him question why he had even come here to begin with. The nail in the coffin was seeing the mutual love between Liara and her husband, which to Garfield was affection both unmistakable and unbearable. Perhaps it made him feel like he was being robbed of something that was rightfully his. Whatever it was stirring his emotions, the need to run away was so overwhelming that he didn't even realize he was dragging Mimi while doing so. His grip on her wrist was so incredibly tight that when he'd finally stopped, her arm had actually turned blue from it. It was then that Gaelic would arrive to ask Garf his question, which would in turn reveal a truth that Garfield had never even considered before. You see, he'd always thought his mother was dead because she'd never returned, so the thought of anything else didn't really occur to him. Knowing now that he was so very wrong to make that assumption, well, that was a harsh truth that really dug into him. Now, it was prior to saying he wasn't related to Liara that there was a swirling torrent of emotion bubbling within him, making him feel sick. As soon as he said what he needed to say though, all he felt after was loss and emptiness. The reason why he decided not to say anything was because doing so would only cause more harm than good. It wouldn't change the fact 15 years were spent with a different family, and it wouldn't change the fact that 15 years were lost as Licia. The only thing it would do is burden her with the guilt of knowing she left behind something precious. So, to put that burden not only on Liara but also her family too, well, Garf knew that that wouldn't be fair. His self-satisfaction didn't take priority over any of that. Sure, he alone would be the one to gain closure, but everyone else would go on to suffer. It was a burden he couldn't share, not even with Frederica or Ryuzu. So, in order to protect everyone else, Garfield knew the best thing to do was just abandon his own desires and do his best to keep everything to himself. That's really what he wanted to do, but yet again the inner conflict within him was tearing him apart. As much as he wanted to keep all of it inside, Garfield just couldn't find the strength to follow through with it. It was a constant back and forth of him wanting to be the tiger he always thought he was and the true emotion he couldn't keep contained anymore. In the end, his inner thoughts had turned into some pretty deep poetry. That's where I'm gonna end today's episode, so if you liked what you saw and want to see more, then be sure to leave a like and subscribe. If you missed the last episode, then you can watch it here, or if you want to see some Danmachi content, you can watch that here. Until next time though, ciao!